And we found the sound effect. Hey, all right, welcome in to the Whistle Stop. He is the voice of the referees, Elliot. He is the voice of the players, Andrew. And I am just the idiot watching and just shouting, just yelling. I don't even know the game. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm just yelling because I'm mad because the game's not going the way I want to. And that's kind of what we're talking about here today. And that is disagreements, dissent, abuse. Basically, any time when the verbal argument is projected at the referee. When is it become then punishable? What is the lines? Elliot, let's get into that. So there's kind of the three phases we kind of were talking about here. A disagreement, it can happen. Then it can escalate into more things. So let's kind of go through that. What is a disagreement and what is something that is considered dissent? Where does the referee kind of make that line?
There's four main variable factors that we look at as referees, and so think of it as the four Ps: personal, public, provocative, and persistent. So personal, I guess, to get to the bottom of that is, would you say this to your colleague at the office or your boss at the office? For a referee, this is our place of work. And so comments of a personal nature find themselves somewhere on that spectrum. It could be low level, like, come on, ref, to something, really that gets to the bottom of your credibility or integrity. So you have a sliding scale of personal. Public, how public is the verbal outburst or the action? So a player just in your ear says something that no one else can hear or no one else can see. Well, that's not very public, and so it may not rise to the level of dissent. But if someone's waving their arms around and screaming it in such a way as to
making a spectacle,
right, and both goalkeepers at both ends of the fields can hear it, the parents can hear it, the coaches can hear it. Well, now by ignoring that, you're creating an issue for yourself in the game. The more public it is, the more it undermines your credibility. Provocative. Now, hopefully that's rare, but there we're talking about something that's offensive, insulting or abusive. So even if that's whispered in a referee's ear, if it's insulting or racist or abusive, but it is highly provocative, then that is not something that a referee can tolerate. And then the fourth P is persistent. It could be that a one-off incident that's a low-level disagreement. Oh, come on, ref. But if that's repeated at every throw-in, every free kick, every goal kick, it does have an undermining effect on the referee if it's not dealt with. And so just like persistent fouls can result in a caution, persistent low-level disagreement can also rise to the level of dissent.
So really only one of those Ps has to be ratcheted all the way up for it to hit into dissent. It's not that they have to be hitting all of them. It's really about just one of those, kind of, as you kind of have those little bars there going into the red there.
Exactly.
Andrew, talking to referees, you are a ref, you are a player. Obviously, you know how you would like to be talked to, but you also know how players tend to talk to referees. As a player, your advice on how to talk to a referee?
Oh boy, yeah, this is a tough one because, of course, I can't say I always get that right myself, despite knowing what it's like to be on both sides. In the heat of the moment, it's very difficult. If there's a decision you disagree with, it's a real challenge to kind of talk yourself off the ledge. I think first of all, it's probably important to point out that just takes a little bit of practice. I think it needs to be very intentional. A lot of players, I don't think they really think about it. That, maybe what they're doing is more than a disagreement, it's dissent, or maybe it even gets up to the level of abuse. So I think one of the main takeaways from this as a player that you can go forward with is it requires a lot of intent to treat the referee with respect. It takes some practice. The best way to approach a referee is really just to ask questions, come from a perspective of trying to understand why they did what they did. Because when you do ask questions and you kind of come from that perspective, and they may be leading questions, you may be saying,
Genuine questions, not what is wrong with you. That's not the questions we're talking about.
Yeah, well, that's a more rhetorical, right? So yeah, genuine questions, not rhetorical, backhanded questions, I suppose. So yeah, I think the best way to handle it is to ask the referee what he saw and why he made that decision. First of all, I think that'll gain a little more respect from the referee's end, and it'll also force the referee to think a little bit about what his decision was, and it'll help get the referee on your side. And as a referee, you appreciate it when a player comes up to you and is taking just the perspective of trying to understand why you made a call, and then you can explain yourself. And typically, you don't always agree. Sometimes there'll be a decision. Sometimes the referee gets it wrong. You'll ask some questions. The referee might say, "You know what? That's just not the way I saw it. If it did happen the way you saw it, you are correct, and it was an incorrect decision." You may realize that you just had a different angle and you saw things differently, and there's a lot of middle ground there. And once you start asking questions and trying to understand what the referee did and why he did it, I think typically reasonable minds always find a way to get past it. But there's really no other way. If you just start making statements, just start hailing insults at a referee, there'll never be a positive outcome.
Elliot, now let's kind of get into that next step, right? So there is dissent, there is being, argumentative, being, aggressive with the ref. When does that bleed into or turn into something much more serious? And that's when we're talking about a referee being abused, and obviously then discipline needing to come in.
So what's the question? Where exactly is the line between?
When does dissent? Because obviously we've gone from discussion to dissent. Now let's go dissent to abuse. When does dissent? When does kind of those smaller infractions of how they are conducting themselves with the referee turn into something much bigger?
So going back to the 4 Ps, it's when you're looking at the red end of that spectrum that we're looking at something that's abusive. So personal, if a comment really attacks the credibility of a referee, you're a cheat. Referee, how much are they paying you? That might be just a straight off example of abuse that can't be tolerated, and by not dealing with it, the referee is inviting more of the same. So that would be an example where you're really undermining the credibility of a referee. And if you're a confident, experienced referee that can handle it with a minimum amount of misconduct, maybe you can handle it with a yellow card, set a clear boundary. The risk there is that you're condoning behaviour that can then get out of hand. And then the provocative P, that's where it's racist, it's discriminatory, it's offensive, it's abusive, where there's absolutely no place for it on a football field, just like there wouldn't be a place for it in your office. So it could be that a referee has handled a game quite beautifully, and then out of nowhere comes this abusive comment, and it's a straight up red card. So there are examples where there's no, here's your other chance, here's my little chat. It's a red card, and you've got to go.
What is one of the worst examples you've been on the receiving end of?
All right, there's a Gotham example where it raises a few different issues, and it wasn't a comment directed at me. It was a game a few years back, 9-a-side, and it was a comment or a gesture that I didn't myself witness, and I didn't have ARs, so I didn't witness it. But a player came to me and said an opponent at a set piece said something homophobic and made a homophobic gesture. And so as a referee, I know I haven't seen it, so I get the 2 captains involved and the players involved, and I say, this is what I've been told. If I see that, if I hear that, without question, it's a straight red card, and your game is done. Now, I can't give that misconduct based on what I've been told by a player, but it's on my radar. And I have to say something because the players need to know it's not okay and that I'm paying close attention. And I have to, the aggrieved player and the aggrieved team need to know that I can't just give a red card based on hearsay, even if I believe it. And the player that's being accused needs to know that he's a very lucky lad to still be on the field, because if I see it, he's gone. But that was an example of a homophobic comment.
Mm-hmm.
If it's true, if it happens and I see it, they're gone. And it's a difficult situation where the ref doesn't see it. You've got to be quite delicate and careful in how you handle it.
And obviously, from a Gotham standpoint, those are kind of those certain things that we just have a zero tolerance for, right? Andrew, bringing it from a Gotham perspective, let's kind of first go with you of how you want referees and players to approach things in our league.
Like it is a recreational league, and what I mean by that is we are all here for fun. I can appreciate that a lot of our players have a very competitive spirit. With that said, though, from the player side, I would really love to see a lot more respect shown towards our referees. In most matches, it's not an issue. However, I still don't think there's enough respect shown towards our referees. What they have to do every day in our leagues is difficult. It's really difficult. We have a lot of, all of our small-sided matches are a one-man system. In New York, even our 11s is a one-man system. They got to cover a lot of ground. They only have the one angle. A lot of these guys that have got, or girls, have a full-time job, or they're students, and they've got a lot on their plate, and they're just here to, honestly, they're just here to help Gotham out and make sure these matches happen. They're not professional referees. And they really, I fully believe almost all our referees give their absolute best. It's just, they still don't get a lot of appreciation for what they do. So from the player side, I just don't know if they appreciate our referees as much as they should. And also, I would love for them to understand how much of a challenge it is. So if you're a player in our league and you're hearing this and you've had issues with our referees in the past, I will simply invite you to give it a shot yourself. And then from the referee side...
We have made that offer a few times now.
Yeah, we've had issues with players, and our response is, well, you know what? How about you give it a shot? We'll let you referee and see how that goes. No one has ever taken us up on that.
Yeah, still waiting for that.
One of these days we'll make that happen. And then, from the referee side, I think some referees in Gotham and just recreational leagues across the country, not just Gotham, I think because it's a rec league that they don't need to worry about giving cards, or that, they shouldn't be punishing players because they're just paying to be here. Or maybe because they are newer to refereeing, they're a little scared to use their cards or report things that they should be, which I know is something Elliot's going to talk about here in a second. But really, I think there should be a zero tolerance for really anything. I mean, obviously referee abuse, but even dissent or abuse to other players, not just the referees. I'd love to see us give out more cards, to be honest, because if a referee even has to think about giving a card in a recreational game, they just shouldn't have to even be in that position. So I would love to see him just say, you know what, if I even have to think about it, here you go. Here's your card, and let's clean up your act.
Elliot, I want to get to the reporting here in a second, but I think one thing I want you to touch on from a referee perspective, as far as guidance for referees, this is the one area of the game where, if there's a foul, if a bad tackle, you have to make a call. You're making a call simply on the laws of the game, but when you're essentially the one being fouled in this situation, how do you handle your own emotions when handling essentially being on the receiving end of abuse and of something that is not of proper conduct of the game?
Yeah, great question. One thing I think is important is, as referees, we kind of have to leave our egos outside the field. There's a danger to reacting overly emotionally to comments that, whether it's low-level disagreement, dissent, or abuse. So on the one hand, you can be too thin-skinned. You can be overly sensitive towards comments, and the reaction the outshot there could be you disrupt the flow of the game. You're taken away from the enjoyment of the players and yourself. It's not nice to be overly sensitive to comments. So you don't want to be overly sensitive. And if you're too thick-skinned, the danger there is that you are acquiescing to the kind of behavior that actually is not acceptable and needs to be dealt with. And if it isn't, you're losing control of the game. And so there's a sweet spot. And the 4Ps are really designed to, if you take your own emotional and your personal feelings out of it, to help a referee diagnose what's the level of this comment. Is it low-level disagreement, dissent, or abuse? And so if your ego is out of the equation and you're looking at it not dispassionately, but objectively, then you give yourself the best chance to deal with low-level poor behavior in a way that stops it growing out of control. And in the way that you conduct yourself, you need to be like, take the high ground, be professional, and be unimpeachable. So be calm. Don't reply to one retort with your own retort and that, escalate like that. Try not to be sarcastic or the smart aleck in the situation, and just talk with that sort of calm assurance, like 2 + 2 = 4. What you've said is unacceptable. If it carries on, you won't be here it's I would say how you conduct yourself is very important as a referee.
I think you just kind of hit on something though real quick right there. Biting back doesn't really work. Doesn't help the situation, right?
It's certainly a risky strategy. Now, in a league like Gotham, there's often a lot of familiarity between the referee and the players. So it's possible that a referee that knows a particular player, maybe he does know a little shortcut to getting that player to come back into line. And it could be a sarcastic comment or something that might not be deemed as professional, but it's effective. But it's a risky move. And as you get into levels of the game where it's affiliated, you don't know the teams, you don't know the players, that becomes even more of a risky strategy, because the risk of getting it wrong is you say something that doesn't de-escalate, it escalates. And so you've got to be a little bit careful, and you've got to, if you're sending somebody off for abuse, you want to make sure that there's no way that player can come back in their appeal and say, yeah, but the referee swore back at me, or the referee said something sarcastic. We have to be unimpeachable. We have to be clean.
You mentioned being too thick-skinned, and that kind of leads into this last bit here, and that's on reporting. And obviously being too thick-skinned, sometimes you don't properly report abuse and dissent that could be a thing that a certain player is very persistent in. How important is properly reporting these incidents?
Yes, important. Look, referees don't get into reffing because they love post-game reports. It's the paperwork, it's the admin side that we don't want to do, but I can't emphasize enough the importance of dealing with dissent and abuse appropriately with yellow and reds, but then post-game handling it in your report, making sure that it's reported accurately and with enough detail that the report is useful. What you might be providing is one piece of the jigsaw, but if multiple referees are reporting correctly and adequately abuse and dissent that's taking place over the course of the season, the assigner and the leagues are seeing not just that one jigsaw piece, but the whole puzzle. And so it might not seem like you're, like it's such a big deal if you don't report this particular incident of dissent or abuse. Actually, it is important. And by not taking your post-game report seriously, you're in a way contributing to the existence of the problem. And so referees have to take responsibility for those post-game.
All right, a lot of talk and conversation about Nottingham Forest, their match with Everton. Obviously, some of the comments that they made before the match, after the match, not only just by players, but literally the club putting out official statements, their manager making comments. So much has come from this match, and just the way that a club, in somewhat unprecedented ways, has gone out against the officiating in this match. Elliot, let's start with you. Let's just start with just the optics of a club putting out official statements on their social media about the refereeing.
Yeah, it's one thing to criticize and hold referees accountable for mistakes that they made. It's a whole other thing to question the integrity and impartiality of a referee. That's really a line that you don't cross. It's possible to make a mistake, get it wrong, without being blamed for bias or being partial to one team or another. So Forest did cross that line. It looks like they've been charged for bringing the game into disrepute, and I think they've got a couple of days from now to reply to that. Be interested to see how that turns out. But yeah, it looks like Forest crossed that line.
So I guess the one of the things that they kind of initially took umbrage with was the assigning of Stuart Atwell as the VAR. He is allegedly a Luton supporter. Luton, obviously, and Nottingham Forest, and Everton to an extent, in a relegation scrap. So that they called that into question, and I think that's a very interesting one. Obviously, these referees, they like the game, right? And with that comes growing up, following the sport, and obviously having some sort of allegiances somewhere, maybe thinned out by this point, but in some cases, I guess, still strong. I remember watching a referee, just like last year, whatever, hooping and hollering in the stands at a Tranmere Rovers game.
Mike Dean.
Yeah, Mike Dean. That was it. Mike Dean, big Tranmere guy. Does this come into play? We actually just had this even in MLS, where a referee was unassigned from a match because there was a photo of him in a Messi jersey. How much does this come into play in the assignments of officials?
Yeah, it's an important factor. Impartiality and the perception of impartiality, equally important. So every referee declares where they live, the club that they support, and if there are any other relevant details that might cause a conflict. So, for example, Michael Oliver's a Newcastle fan. He will never be assigned to referee Newcastle or Sunderland, their local rivals. Now, there was an interesting example a couple of years ago. Jonathan Moss, now retired, he's a Sunderland fan, so he can't referee Sunderland or Newcastle. But he was the former PE teacher of James Milner at primary school. And so there was a potential conflict of interest there when he refereed a game between Liverpool, Milner's club at the time, versus Palace. He gave Milner a red card in that game. So even though there was a potential conflict of interest there, is a former teacher going to be able to judge impartially his former student? It was a fair question. In this case, Milner got sent off by Moss. So that was a real unusual situation, but the potential for conflict was there. Now, I think a very relevant precedent for this Stuart Atwell situation was 2016, when Leicester and Spurs were battling for the Premier League title. Kevin Friend, he lived in Leicester, and he was affiliated with the Leicester FA, and for that reason, even though he wasn't a Leicester fan, he'd also gone to Leicester games in his own time. So for those reasons, even though he wasn't a Leicester fan, he was not given any appointments involving Leicester or Spurs in that title running. So now with this Stuart Atwell case, I think it's right to consider a referee's allegiance. And in this case, Luton and Forest are direct rivals to avoid relegation. So there's a potential for conflict of interest there. I actually think, Forest and football in general need to look at whether Atwell was an appropriate person to be given the assignment. Now, that doesn't mean there's a suggestion of impartiality, but it's the perception of it. I think you can, if you can avoid any sort of criticism from the game about a referee's assignment, then avoid it if you can. So in this case, even though Forrest may have been right to question it, that doesn't mean Atwell in this case was impartial, but it created an issue.
What about when you hear the referees will do a match, it's a big match, one side feels like the match just did not go their way from an officiating standpoint, and then is there a precedent from the club or from the officials, from the FA to go, okay, well maybe not assign him the next time for that big match, for that matchup, or for it's Chelsea is complaining, so we won't assign him for Chelsea matches for the next couple weeks.
Yeah, that is a relevant factor. Look, I mean, it's one of the variables that goes into what is a very complicated assigning process. One example, I think 2007, Clattenburg was reffing Everton v Liverpool. He doesn't support Everton or Liverpool. There wasn't a direct conflict, but he was heavily criticised. I think he gave a couple of red cards to Everton. He was heavily criticised, and even though there wasn't a suggestion of bias, just to manage the situation, I think he didn't referee back at Goodison Park for a few years. It might have been, I think 6 years or 7 years or something. They didn't send him back to Goodison Park. So yes, you can take a referee's specific performance against a specific team or at a specific place into account.
And you're bringing it to the Gotham level. Soccer communities are tight-knit and small, so referees and players know each other, and referees also play, and referees are buddies or former teammates of players. We have occasionally heard things like this of, don't let this guy ref this game because of this, or kind of what we just talked about with Elliot, don't let this ref do this game because he doesn't handle this team well. From an admin side and try to manage and referees at a rec level, how does that play in?
First, it's important to note that we don't always have the luxury of thinking through that too much. The referee pool is not large. We're in a shortage of referees across the country. I don't think that's not even just soccer. It extends to pretty much all sports, all levels, at least here in the States. I'm not sure about the entire world, but it's difficult to build a strong referee roster. There's just not enough referees, and a lot of that is because of the abuse we spoke about earlier. So I think that's just the first thing to note, that it's important to consider that we don't necessarily have the luxury to really think through that. However, we do instruct both our referee coordinators and our on-site supervisors to consider any history a referee may have with a certain team when assigning them to a specific field. We don't normally take in allegiances to consideration because it's pretty rare that that's relevant. I know in Cincinnati, I don't referee that often these days, but when I do, I do have plenty of friends that play in the league, so I avoid refereeing them for obvious reasons. So it happens occasionally where we take that into consideration. A lot of our issues are typically where teams request certain referees to not referee them anymore for whatever reason. We will work with that a little bit, but I'm a pretty big believer that doesn't really solve anything. If a referee is really underperforming that poorly, then we need to address it on that end. If the team really can't behave themselves, then we need to address it on that end. We don't take those requests. I mean, we'll maybe consider it if we have the luxury of moving things around all the time, but
I know we've done it plenty of times where it's been, okay, this team and this referee had a very a disagreement. The team's kind of hot. Okay, so maybe for the next couple of weeks, we won't assign that ref to that game and let that situation cool down. Yeah, we'll give them a little bit of a breather, and similar to the situation that Elliot was just illustrating as well. But for the most part, we don't really take those requests. Our players and teams, they don't get to tell us who to schedule and when to schedule them. That's for us to decide. So, it happens, but
It'd be nice if we had more of a luxury of just a ton of great referees in the pool at all times.
Elliot, you kind of mentioned the whole, perceived biases and stuff like that. I think with all of that, there's also that perception of the integrity of the game, right? And that's, in a nutshell, what Nottingham Forest is being charged with, is basically calling out the integrity and the reputation of the sport and of the league and of the federation. How important is it from a referee standpoint, an officiating standpoint, to maintain and to protect integrity?
It's obviously important for everyone involved. Referees, players, clubs, every stakeholder wants integrity. I think it's all very well saying referees require integrity. We've also got to act in a way that commands respect, and we've got to do our bit. We've got to make sure that we're fit and our knowledge of the laws are up to date, and that we're just bringing our A games every week, and that we're clear and that we're transparent. So I think we've, a little bit like I was touching on earlier, we've got to make sure that we're conducting ourselves right. So that integrity isn't an issue. But again, just to repeat again what we said before, it's possible for mistakes to happen without calling into question a referee's integrity or their bias. Forest, in the aftermath of the Everton game, was saying it's corrupt, it's always against us. Well, in order for that statement to be true, what I would need to see would be every single referee decision for every single team in every single game, and then tally the mistakes against the correct decisions, and then have some sort of league table against, factually, not anecdotally, who's suffered from the mistakes and who's benefited from mistakes. And then that doesn't even go into the reasons why the mistakes are being made. It could be just genuine mistakes and you're unlucky. And if there is something, underneath it along the lines of bias or corruption, you need, that's a bold statement, a bold claim. And for a bold claim, you need strong evidence. So you can't just be throwing out accusations of bias and corruption if you haven't got the evidence to back it up. So that doesn't help.
I think that was it. We got it?
I think so. I think that's, yeah.
There we go. We did it. I like it.
All right. Yeah, I think that's a wrap.
Cool.
Good.
Good work, gents.
Yeah, I think